This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast dealing with the dark feminine. I'm your host, Breach Burke. Now this week we are going to, I'm starting to take some requests. This is July 2022, and I had a whole podcast schedule prepared for this year, and I've pretty much followed it for the first 6 months. What I'm finding at this point, though, is that there's some parts of the schedule that just aren't going to work out. I had wanted to do some more on, say, Filipino mythology and things like that, but there's just not enough information. I'm finding 1 or 2 lines of information, mostly on the internet, and I don't like to rely exclusively on like Wikipedia and things. I mean, I might pick up a few summaries here and there if they seem like they match other things that I've read, but I don't. But I like to have more information than that to be able to present to you. Otherwise, I feel like I'm just, pulling it out of somewhere. So, being there was kind of a lack of information on some of the things I wanted to do, I've decided that some people on YouTube have made requests. Don't have quite so many from Patreon, but I do have, some from various social media outlets. So I'm going to do a few of those now, going forward. And this week, we're going to look at Rhiannon. Rhiannon is a figure in Welsh mythology. Okay, she's a figure that's presented in the Mabinogion, which is the it is basically the primary text of Welsh mythology, and it is the and it fits in because we had done a podcast on Bendit Malme, the what they call the Mother's Blessing, which we did in the last episode. So in a way, it's fitting to do Rhiannon because this is a continuation of the Welsh mythology theme. So Rhiannon is where I'm going to start, and actually, if you follow me on social media, I will have the list of what the replacement podcasts are going to be, like what I'm going to do instead of the ones that were on the original schedule. So with that, let's talk about Rhiannon. Now, a lot of people associate Rhiannon with the Stevie Nicks, the Fleetwood Mac song called Rhiannon, which Stevie Nicks always introduces as the story about a Welsh witch. And she, of course, is referring to the Rhiannon from a novel that is called Triad by Mary Bartlett Leader. Now, I have not read this novel. I just know that this is what her source is for the lyrics of that song. That was her inspiration. And that Rhiannon, of course, is very loosely based on the traditional mythological Rhiannon. But only loosely based. So we're gonna talk about the mythological one and not the fictional one. Now the Mabinogion is it has 4 parts to it. They call it the 4 branches. Okay, and 4 branches focus on, as you might imagine, 4 different stories. And the stories begin with the Otherworld. Okay, because this is an account of the princes of Dyfed in particular, who are, and the certain actions they have and encounters with the Otherworld that lead to, that lead to certain events that happen within the kingship, that lead to certain events that, the outcomes of certain wars and other events that, that all connect up with each other. And in this particular case, we are looking at the 1st and 3rd branches in particular, and at the end, just a very little bit at the 2nd branch of the Mabinogion. So, because we want to deal exclusively with Rhiannon, there's a lot of background we could get into here, but I do believe we have enough material here that just talking about Rhiannon herself is sufficient for this discussion on this episode. So who is Rhiannon? Rhiannon is an otherworldly woman, might be a goddess, and she appears as, in the 1st branch as what you would call a marvel. Okay, at least that's one translation. So she appears in a place called Gorsedd Arbaeth. Let me see if I'm saying that right. Arbaeth. My Welsh, of course, is just like everything else, but trying to get some of these pronunciations right. Gorsev Arbaerth. And it's, which is actually a mound. It is a ancestral mound. There's many of these throughout various places in England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. And this one is one, again, like a lot of these mounds, they are said to be a connection to the Otherworld. Certainly in Irish mythology, we think of the mounds as being where became the dwelling place of the Tuatha De Danann after the sons of Mil took over the earth. So they are, this is that other world where the entrances tend to open up, usually around Beltane or Samhain, okay, when we talk about the veil thinning between the worlds, but also at other times of the year as well. For example, the solstices and equinoxes may be other points at which that veil would thin, okay. So, in the first branch, we see Rhiannon. Okay, she actually falls in love with the prince of Dyfed, who is called Pwyll. And Pwyll goes with, he goes at Beltane, and he decides he is going to go to Gorsev Arbaerth he wants to have the expression is that you either will experience blows or you will experience a marvel. Now, when we say blows, what we mean is that, you're either going to be, whacked upside the head with a catastrophe of some kind or with some horrible experience, or you're going to see something really wondrous. So, in this case, they go to Gorsev Arbaerth, and they end up seeing a woman appearing on a white horse. Okay, and this person is Rhiannon. So, Pwyll decides he's going to get on his horse and he wants to follow this woman. Now, I do have the text of this from the Mabinogion, but it's the translation I have is quite dated. So, I'm going to actually read the translation of this particular event, but do be advised that this particular translation is not it is rather dated. You'll know it's by Lady Charlotte Guest, and it's the one that I have. I have a Dover edition of this, so bear with me here. But this is how it's related. So they make the decision that they want to go to this place. So it says, and the next day they amused themselves until it was time to go to the meat. And when the meat was ended, Pwyll said, "Where are the hosts that went yesterday and the day before to the top of the mound?" "Behold, Lord, we are here," they said. "Let us go," said he, "to the mound to sit there. And do thou," he said to the page who tended his horse, "saddle my horse well, and hasten with him to the road, and bring also my spurs with thee." Now, it should be noted that Rhiannon was sighted before this. He's noted he's gone to the mound 2 days before, and he has sent his messengers after this woman on the white horse. And both times they were completely unable to catch up with her. Okay, so she's just ahead of them, but they can't quite get to her. Okay, so the youth did thus. Okay, moving on back to the story. And they went and sat upon the mound, and ere they had been there but a short time, but they beheld the lady coming by the same road, and in the same manner, and at the same pace. "Young man," said Pwyll, "I see the lady coming. Give me my horse." And no sooner had he mounted his horse that she passed him, and he turned after her and followed her. And he let his horse go, bounding playfully, and thought that at the second step or the third he should come upon her. But he came no nearer to her than at first. Then he urged his horse to its utmost speed, yet he found it availed nothing to follow her. Then said Pwyll, "O maiden, for the sake of him whom thou best lovest, stay for me." "I will stay gladly," said she. "It were better for thy horse, had thou asked it long since." She's telling him, this is what you should have asked for to begin with, instead of just chasing me around. So the maiden stopped. She threw back that part of her headdress which covered her face, and she fixed her eyes upon him, and began to talk with him. "Lady," asked he, "whence comest thou, and whereunto dost thou journey?" "I journey on mine own errand." That's an important thing to remember, said she, "and right glad am I to see thee." "My greeting be unto thee," said he. Then he thought that the beauty of all the maidens and all the ladies that he had ever seen was nothing compared to her beauty. "Lady," he said, "wilt thou tell me aught concerning thy purpose?" "I will tell thee," said she. "My chief quest was to seek thee." So I'm looking for you, she says. Behold, said Puish, this is to me the most pleasing quest on which thou couldst have come, and wilt thou tell me who thou art? I will tell thee, lord, said she, I am Rhiannon. And they, the daughter of, and I don't have his name right, so I'm not going to try to say it. And then they sought to give me a husband against my will. But no husband would I have, and that because of my love for thee. Neither will I yet have one, unless thou reject me. And hither have I come to hear thy answer. By heaven, said Puish, behold, this is my answer. If I might choose among all the ladies and damsels in the world, thee I would choose. Verily, said she, if thou art thus minded, make a pledge to meet me ere I am given to another. The sooner I may do so, the more pleasing it will be unto me, said Puish. And wheresoever thou wilt, there will I meet with thee. I will that thou meet with thee this day, 12-month, at the palace of her father, and I will cause a feast to be prepared, so that it be ready against thou come. Okay, so what we see here, he sees Rhiannon, he sends his 2 messengers to follow her, to no avail. They can't catch up with her. So he says, fine, on the 3rd day, I'm gonna try myself. He follows her, same result, until he tells her, stay. And then she says to him, well, yeah, I'll stay, and you should have asked that to begin with. Why are you just chasing around me, after me in curiosity? Why don't you say to me, hey, I want to talk to you, right? So he finds out that she is there, because as it turns out, she is in love with him, and she is seeking. She doesn't like the engagement that she's in. She is engaged to a man called Gwalapclid, and she wants to. She does not want to marry this individual. So she tells him at 12-month. Now, why 12-month? Because that's when the gates to the Otherworld open again. Okay, that's Beltane next the following year, and of course it's got to be Beltane and not Samhain, because this is not a moment of death. This is a moment of marriage. Okay, this is a moment of this is what we associate Beltane with, this month of May, right? Because Beltane or Beltania is the Celtic word for May. So she, so they make this arrangement that he's gonna come back in a year. So one thing that I find that is interesting about this first encounter. Now, first of all, remember she says she's there, on an errand of her own. So she has a husband chosen for her she doesn't want. She wants to make her own choice. But you notice it also has to be his choice. Okay? He has the freedom to accept or reject her. And, she's already chosen him. And so there has to be an autonomy here on both sides. Now, this is not typical of arranged marriages, certainly. And it says something about Rhiannon. Now, again, one of the things that's said about her is there's nothing here that says that she's a goddess. It just simply says that she's a queen, and it does say that she comes from the Otherworld. And in this respect, she's quite similar to Macha in the Ulster Cycle myth, who appears and comes to live with Chthonia, who is a very wealthy chieftain within within the Ulstermen, within their tribe under Conor MacNessa. And same thing, she just comes in and chooses him as a husband. Now, in Macha's case, she just came in and chose him as a husband. But there's nothing that specifically says that this person is a goddess. However, it's very clear that this person comes from the Otherworld, and that they are not human. And what we see here, now the fact that he is a prince of David, suggests that there's a bestowing of sovereignty here. Okay, just like we see in some of the other myths, we see this, the idea of the goddess who, Morrigan is a good example, because when the Dagda in the Tuatha De Danann wants to win the battle at Moytura, what does he do? He comes upon the Morrigan. He has sex with her, and thus in doing so, she grants sovereignty to him, right? And the sovereignty in this case means, yes, this land you shall have, and I will take it away from the people who are currently here. And in fact, she does that. She makes it so that she sings her song and the Fomorians go marching into the sea, and the Tuatha De Danann are victorious after their oppression by the Fomorians, and they're able to claim that land. Similarly, we see this with the Morrigan when it comes to Cuchulainn. She approaches him several times, offering him sex, okay, or offering him that thing, and he makes the mistake of refusing her. So in the end, his claim to all of that is destroyed. There's a definite need here for, we also see this, that there's actually historical evidence that kings or people who made the chieftains or the kings, the tribal kings, have some kind of a ritual of marrying the land goddess. Okay, so here the fact that Rhiannon's coming and that the land goddess in a sense chooses the person, right? This is what's implied, at least here. And so Rhiannon has chosen Buesh, and so in a way, just as a story of perhaps the lineage of these particular Celtic tribes, this would kind of legitimize his future kingship or his kingship. Okay, so he's made legitimate by her interest in him, and the fact that they agree to marry each other, and the fact that it's mutual too, because obviously when you make that marriage oath, you don't want to break it. Okay, so the next thing that happens is that she, the year and the 12-month passes. Okay, he returns, and they have their wedding feast. Now, a stranger appears at the wedding feast, disguised stranger, and manages to get Puesh to promise him anything that he wants, which is careless and stupid, because the man turns out to be Gwal, Gwawl, I think that's how you say his name, and but what he wants is Rhiannon. Okay, you just married her, but I want her. That he was the original betrothed. He wants her back. And so Rhiannon rebukes him again. She says, you don't make those kinds of promises. He's dealing with the Otherworld here, and he's dealing with a lot of magic. So this is not the, he's handling this all very, very naively, okay, because he's walked into this all very naively. So what she does is she says to him, she basically says to Gwal, she says, okay, this is my wedding feast here. If you want me to have a wedding feast with you, that will have to be in another 12-month. I'll have a wedding to you. So this is how she gets around it. In the meantime, she gives Puesh, she tells him this is how you're going to get around it. She gives him a small bag, okay, that she has him appear at the wedding feast as a beggar, just humbly asking for the small bag to be filled with food. But it's enchanted in such a way that as they try to continually fill the bag, it can't be filled. So Gwawl is called in to try to deal with this enchantment. So what ends up happening when he does that is that Puesh traps him in the bag. And then they play this game called Badger in the Bag, okay? Won't get into that, but so basically his men come rushing in. They've been waiting outside, and they kick him around, and he's begging for his life, and they said, well, we'll spare your life, but you have to give Rhiannon back to Puesh, and you also have to promise not to take revenge, and that's interesting, okay, so that's something to be borne in mind. So then Rhiannon finally marries Puesh, and she journeys to Dyfed as its queen. So okay, so there's a book I was referencing for this podcast, and it's called Women in Celtic Myth by Moira Caldecott. Okay, now what I like about her particular interpretation is there is sort of that psychological, symbological, mythological studies kind of element to the way she talks about it. But some of the way that she talks about it, while it's understandable and typical, is I prefer to talk about it in a slightly different way, but some of her interpretations I do think are helpful. So I will, interject a few here and there where I think they are useful. And here she makes the comment about Puesh in this story, and she says he's struggling with the Otherworld, and it's only through the help of Rhiannon that he's able to be victorious. Okay, he has naively walked into this territory, and and he needs the magic of, really, when you think about this is the magic of, again, in Jungian terms, of the anima, or if you want to look at props folklore motifs, this is that magical female who appears as the magical helper. Okay, she is there because she loves him. She helps him through this encounter, and you notice it can only be solved through sort of other trickery, if you were. It's, when you're dealing with the other world, the world of fairy, you're not dealing directly with anything, and nothing is what it appears to be. So you have to learn to kind of be on your guard and not take things at face value. And so that's at least one of the lessons that we have here. Okay, so the next thing that happens is, they're married, they're living in David. They are happy for a couple of years, right? But then there's a pressure for them to produce an heir, because she has not, and there are people who are telling him they should get rid of her and put her to death because she's barren. But he's not willing to reject her as barren. And indeed, in the 3rd year, she does become pregnant, and she does produce the appropriate heir. However, the night after she's given birth, the child disappears. It's taken away. And there were 6 maids. She had, maids who were supposed to be watching him, but they fell asleep. And so they're afraid of being put to death. So they go out and kill a puppy. Yes, I'm sorry, I don't like that either. But they take the blood and they smear it on her face, and they claim that not only did she kill the child, but that she cannibalized it. Okay. Now, that's quite serious, because there's a mythological implication about the power that goes on there as well. Typically, when you see cannibalism in mythology, it's, there's 2 possible meanings of it, but one is that you are, in a family situation, it is one taking the power back. So here's the one who's granted sovereignty, and in this case, this is almost like a taking back of sovereignty. At least that's what's implied. Now, obviously, Rhiannon did not really do this, but that is what they're implying, that by cannibalizing a child, it's like taking the power of that child back into herself. Okay? And, so what ends up happening, now she's wrongly accused. So now we're into the whole motif of the wronged wife. And she ends up having to engage in a penance, where she has to sit outside the castle, and she has to carry any visitors in like a horse with them on her back. And she has to tell them the story of her misdeed. Because her husband still won't kill her, and he still won't demote her as queen. She's still queen, and she still sits beside him. But she has to engage in this penance. This is his compromise. And he's kind of bewildered by this whole thing. But he's still not ready to give up on his oath or on his wife. Okay? You notice he's being tempted to do that, to break his oath to the land goddess, as it were. Again, I'm speaking figuratively. The Mabinogion does not necessarily say that she's a land goddess, and the scholarship does not necessarily say she's a land goddess. But this is someone, in some sense, who has granted him sovereignty, and he's not willing to break that oath, which tells you something about his character. Okay, whatever else, it does that. Now, again, Caldecott suggests that this is, and I think very rightly, this has to do with the way that we see the other in a very negative sense. The way I've talked a lot about the quote-unquote foreign other, and the way in which, especially in tribal communities, there's like a xenophobia that takes place. The other is somehow sinister. It's somehow evil. So to paint her as someone who would eat her child and cannibalize it, think what we've seen about the dark feminine. Think about figures like Lamia or Marmo or Gello in the Greek. These horrible figures, otherworldly, underworld figures who steal children and cannibalize them, right? So there's an implication that Rhiannon is one of those women, right? So she's being mocked and humiliated and treated almost in a fearful way because she is clearly a being from the other world. So she's like alien to them. Yes, it's the way in which we'd probably treat aliens if we encountered them, right? It's this idea of what was it? I'm remembering a Mystery Science Theater 3000 All of a Sudden. It was the one, I think it was The Creeping Terror, which is a hilarious episode if you've never seen that. But at one point there's this really horrible, low budget film where there's this rocket ship and they see it, and and the comment from the audience was, well, I don't understand it, so let's start shooting. And that's exactly kind of, that kind of sums it up. It's just, we don't understand you, so you must be a threat. So, yeah. So I think you can take, at least that's one thing that you can take away from that, that particular part of the story. The other thing that's interesting, though, here is not only that Rhiannon rides on a horse, but that she is also made to get on all fours like a horse. And as we will find out, her son, who is actually alive and was taken away, has a connection to horses himself. Okay, so so now what we're looking at is now we have the mythology of Epona. This is usually brought in. Epona is a Celtic goddess associated with horses. Now, she is most definitely a goddess, and important enough that even when the Romans encountered Epona, Epona worship made its way back to Rome, which is highly unusual. Celtic deities did not, you see things happen the other way around. Okay, you see Roman deities being adopted in Britain and different places. Different places throughout what they would call Gaul. Okay, through the Gaulish region. But you rarely see it go the other way around. Now, some people are saying that Epona and Rhiannon are, the same, or they're from the same root. Now, I don't think there's any real proof of that. As it's been stated, the fact that Rhiannon rode a horse and that there's these little horse motifs are about the only thing she seems to have in common with Epona. That said, there is also a lot of Celtic scholarship that feels that that is still a very likely association. So I'm, academically, either way, nonetheless, there is definitely that horse motif, and has to do with the importance of horses. I do want to read what Caldecott says on this in particular. Let me just find my spot here. She says, okay, this is just quoting her from page 37 of her book. She says, I don't think the ancient Celts thought the horse was a goddess, any more than you think the dove is the Holy Spirit, or Egyptians thought that Horus was a falcon. At a time when Celtic tribes relied heavily on the horse, it would be natural for them to use this symbol. Now, one of the things she also mentions here is that the horse tends to be associated with, there's sort of this mysterious being. The fact that the horse seems to be associated with the feminine. And she's trying to link it to the fact that the Great Mother cult was popular. As you know, I'm not one of those believers necessarily that there was like this big, I mean, not that people, obviously that they didn't worship women, but that, there was this exclusive matriarchy that predated everything. Maybe not. I mean, I wouldn't assume that. Nonetheless, the horse symbol, as she noted, is associated with women. So Epona, Rhiannon, and then, of course, even Macha. Now, that's a story that has not been told. Macha, okay. The Macha stories are fresh to me because I've just come back from Ireland, and I've spent a couple months researching Macha among the other manifestations of the goddess, the great queen goddess, phantom queen, called Morrigan, right? And one of the things I learned when I was up at Navan Fort, which is also called Awan Macha, is the story. There is a story about Macha that is associated with horses. And I'm going to digress slightly and tell you that story because I think it matches up this white horse symbolism. So now the town of Armagh, I'm surprised I did not realize this earlier, but Armagh, which is, if anybody knows anything about Ireland or Catholic Ireland, even though this is in Northern Ireland, which is British territory, it's kind of the seat of the Catholic Church within Ireland. I mean, it's one of the main. Armagh is one of the main bishoprics in Ireland. It's the archbishop seat. It's huge. And the legend there is that St. Patrick went there and he wanted to put his church or his cathedral there in Armagh. Now, Armagh is short for Ardmacha. Okay, because as I went through the town, I noticed all of these places that are named after Macha. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And I'm reading these signs in the Irish, and I'm going, And then I realized that as I was reading something, they said, yeah, this is Ard Macha. This is the height of Macha. That's what Armagh actually means. And it's funny because we don't say, normally the GH in, in Irish pronunciation is pronounced like it's got a K sound to it. Like, for example, Loch is spelled Lough, right? But Armagh is not pronounced Armagh. It's pronounced Armagh. So it's like, it's like the Macha piece of it's there, but it's kind of removed even from the way that it's pronounced. Nonetheless, in the town, there are many references to Macha. And, okay, so this is a place that's clearly, and there's a whole mythology, this is not about Macha, so I don't want to get into that mythology. But the story is that St. Patrick went there to build his cathedral. He went to the chieftain who was there at the time, who I think his name was Dare. I'm not 100% sure. I'd have to look that up. But St. Patrick asks him, says, I want to build my cathedral here. And Dare tells him, no, you can't. This is sacred ground. You can't build your cathedral here. Because Dare did not take, St. Patrick's religion to be anything that should, he was not interested in replacing what was there with Christianity. So St. Patrick tells him, well, if you don't let me build my church here, I'm going to kill your wife. yes, this is St. Patrick for you. But Dare still refuses him, says, no, I'm not letting you build your church here. So St. Patrick kills his wife. And so Dare, after this, he relents, and he says, because I guess St. Patrick says to him, okay, well, now if you let me build my church, I'll bring your wife back if you let me build my church. So he relents. And St. Patrick magically and mystically brings his wife back from the dead. Right? So he gets to build his church on Ardmaka. Right? But as he's doing so, as this church building is going on, presumably he's not doing it himself, a white horse appears on the property, and he kills the white horse. And he goes back to Dare and says, I don't want your Macha returning to my site, because he equates the appearance of the white horse with Macha. Okay? And so, now some people just say, well, this symbolizes Christianity's, whatever, over paganism. I don't know. I have some much stronger views on that, but including the fact that Macha probably never left that place. But anyway, it's again, not to digress too much into that. Nonetheless, we see this idea of these goddesses associated with sovereignty also being associated with horses, or at least with the white horse. Okay. Now, whether Epona is a sovereignty goddess or not, that I can't really be sure of. But nonetheless, horses in a way might imply sovereignty because they imply a freedom. Certainly they imply a freedom of movement, right? Because you can ride a horse. There is one other connection that I think of between the horses and these, whether it be Epona, whether it be Rhiannon, whether it be, Macha. And I think the Rhiannon story in particular, I find myself thinking about another female figure from Greek mythology, Demeter Erinyes, okay, which I've talked about in my podcast on the Erinyes, or the Furies. And this is the Demeter, of course, is the goddess of agriculture, okay? And she is, there's the whole myth of her in Persephone, which I'm sure is familiar to many of you. If not, I do have a podcast on Persephone. But nonetheless, Persephone is her daughter, who is abducted and taken away into the underworld to marry Hades, king of the underworld. Now, and Demeter goes on this long search. And now what is said, now you don't really necessarily hear a lot about this in the narrative that's recited in the Homeric hymns, but at one point, Demeter, in her anger, she's pursued, but, interestingly, she's pursued by Poseidon, and she turns herself into a horse. In her angry state, she turns herself into a horse, and Poseidon then comes upon her and mates with her, okay? Because if we remember from Greek mythology, Poseidon is not only the god of the sea, he is also the god of horses. Okay. So this furious form of Demeter, this kind of chthonic form, is very interestingly, I just find it very interesting that connection between it, because of course Demeter, as we know, is a land goddess. She is agricultural. Demeter also does make an appearance in, certainly in Britain she does. And a lot of, there is a lot of the Mabinogion that takes place in Britain. Okay. So, and there have been statues of Demeter found in England. So, and possibly other places as well. I haven't, I think somebody did tell me there was one that was found in Chester as well, if I'm not mistaken. Which, of course, is actually right in the area where some of this particular legend takes place, near Hereford, which is, kind of on the coast, that there's border between Wales and England. And, so, I don't know. So I just find that, I'm not suggesting that there's, evidence or whatever for the connection between Demeter Erinyes and these other horse figures, but that feminine horse associated, in this kind of underworld context, this kind of feminine figure, in this kind of context where the woman is kind of put into not only into this degrading position, but this is also a woman who has lost her child, okay, whose child has been abducted, has disappeared. Now, again, that's about the end of the similarities. Obviously, what happens in the Demeter story is not what happens in the Rhiannon story, but I just find it interesting. I'm not, I don't want to put out there that there's any evidence that these things are connected, but I think just from a symbolic standpoint, I find it interesting. Okay, so the next thing that happens. Now we want to talk about Tynon, who is the, or Tyronon, I think is how you say his name. So her child actually ends up with him, and he is the horse lord, and he keeps a mare that foals, gives birth every May Eve. Okay, so the day before Beltane, but a monstrous demonic claw always comes and takes the new baby. So at the moment that Rhiannon loses the child, the Lord discovers a supernatural human boy who grows up with a natural affinity for horses to become the great knight who is called Prudhomme, later to be revealed to be Rhiannon's son. And eventually, Prudhomme and Rhiannon are reunited. Okay, and that the foal that is finally born here, just as he was taken. There's this kind of there's this snatching away of the first child, and then there's almost the second birth that figuratively speaking at least, that seems to happen, or maybe literally. And so this horse that ends up being born, finally, ends up being the horse that Prudhomme rides. Like, he has a bond with this particular horse. Okay, and again, the fact that he's Rhiannon's son and has this affinity for horses is quite interesting. Now, it was pointed out that there is a South Welsh folk ritual called Mari Lloyd, I think that's how you say it, or Mari Lloyd. And that means gray mare. And it's an interesting kind of a ritual where someone appears either with a horse's head or, carrying one on a stick or wearing one. I don't know. There's different, but that the group with the Mari Lloyd shows up, and there's kind of a riddling that goes, back and forth between the people out, with the Mari Lloyd, and the people inside the house. Like, there's riddles that go back and forth. It's kind of interesting little folk ritual, interesting to read about. And apparently it does still go on. And some people think, again, that this is some kind of a survival of either Epona or something to do with Rhiannon. But there's no real proof of that. Possibly even Macha, too, because Macha in some cases is known as the Grey Mare, even though Macha is not technically a Welsh, deity. You're looking at this kind of overlap here, at least on the front of talking about horses or mares. But, but again, there's no real proof that these things are linked together in the most academic sense. But nonetheless, the connections are interesting to look at. So, or the potential parallels, I should say. Okay. So that's really what happens so Rhiannon in the end is reunited with her son. Puish actually feels very bad about her going through her penance. And he actually, in spite of the fact that he blunders through some things and he's careless and, he makes the mistake of not believing her, he doesn't actually do the worst thing. He doesn't break his oath. And he does actually love her. So he does eventually die. And so Rhiannon, Prudhomme ends up becoming, sort of the king, but he's off on other errands. He's fighting wars. He's doing things. She's kind of running the show. And so, there's the second branch of the Mabinogion. And so that, we're not going to really cover that. There's one piece of that I'll talk about at the end. But so let's move on to the third branch. And the main character here is somebody called Mabinogi. Okay? And he is actually a companion of Prudhomme. Now, they have gone to Ireland. There's wars that go on in Ireland, and which are a complete disaster, where everybody, all their tribal people are complete, who go over are completely destroyed. There's only what they call the 7 survivors. Okay, and Prudhomme and Mabinogi are are two of them. They're two of the survivors, and the survivors supposedly stay there for, I think it's a period of 7 years, and then the king, Bran the Blessed, they he asks them to remove his head and to bury it in London, so to protect Britain from invasion. That's tradition, and they actually do engage in this task. However, because they've been away for such a long time, the kingship of Britain has been usurped by Manawydan's nephew, called, I think his name's Caswallon. I think that's how it, I think you say it how it appears. So Manawydan, but he's not interested in sovereignty at this point. He's an older man. He also has a connection. He is considered to be a child of the god of the sea. Okay, and his, if you think his name is quite similar to the Celtic god of the sea, whose name I'm probably not sure I'm going to say correctly, but it's very similar. There probably is a connection there. I mean, but he is considered to be, so he is also sort of an otherworldly child, although he's not a child at this point. And because he has given up his sovereignty in really what's around the area of London or in Britain, Pudami says, he can come stay in Dyfed. Pudami is still the king. He still has sovereignty, right? But he allows, he gives him the use of that land. So the other thing, though, that Pudami does is he arranges a marriage between Manawydan and his mother, Rhiannon. Now, when Rhiannon is initially introduced to Manawydan, they like each other. They seem to have things in common. They talk, they get on. But then she hears him sort of conferring with her son, and she says, kind of, what's going on here? And when he says his intention, she gets very angry. She says, and when was I going to be consulted about this? Because again, Rhiannon is about sovereignty. You'll see this in several different places. She is about being her own person and being her own woman. And, but fortunately for her, Manawydan, he's not a jerk. He's not trying to deceive her into anything. And he basically says to her, look, this is your choice. I would like this. I think this would be good, but you have the final, decision on this. And so she kind of looks at him, and then she kind of smiles and says, okay, yeah, I'll go along with this. But ultimately it's because he gives her the choice, which was the very smart thing to do. Because again, you can see this as a guy who's not looking to make trouble. He just wants to get on with his business. He would like to see prosperity, but not, he's tired of making war. Okay, so then we have another event. Pudami is married to a woman called Kigva, and, who is a fully human woman, by the way. And so now the next big event takes place, where they all go back to Gorsev Arberith, and in going back there, they're going back at Beltane, and they're going back in the hopes of seeing a marvel and seeing the Otherworld. The mists come, and I think Rhiannon, there's nobody really entirely sure why they decide to do this. Some people think, oh, she's kind of homesick for the Otherworld and she wants to see it. But whatever the reason, remember it said that you're either going to come to blows or you're going to see a marvel. And in this case, the worst happens. They walk in, they don't know where they are, they can't get out, and they're in this land that's totally barren and devoid of anything. It's a land completely without domestic animals. It's a land without, it's the opposite of an abundant land. It's barren. And being now they're trapped in this place, they have to go make the best of it. So they end up stopping in 3 different places where they do go and they try to build up a business and, do a trade. And they're successful, but then their competition becomes hostile and drives them out. So, and again, in all these places, Pudami wants to fight, but Manawydan says, no, we're not going to fight. We'll just move on. This happens 3 times. Okay. And then finally, they return to Dyfed. Okay. And so then Manawydan and Pudami decide to go hunting in this land, and they end up following this white boar. Now, the fact that it's white tells you that it's magical, because boars are not, generally speaking, white. The boar also tends to be a very chthonic symbol. I've talked about the boar, in previous podcasts. as tending to be they're very chthonic. They tend to be associated with the dark feminine in their symbolism. And so the boar runs towards this newly built tower that hasn't been there before. And Manawydan is saying, you shouldn't go in there, but Pradami's hounds have run in there. So he's like, no, I have to go in and get my hounds. And when he's in there, there's this large golden vessel or cup. And he decides to drink from the vessel, and when he does, he's immediately trapped there. In fact, one version says that he turns to stone, but he's trapped in this place. So Manawydan goes back home and has to tell Rhiannon what's happened. Rhiannon's upset with him for not even trying to rescue Pradami. So she says she's going to go do it herself. And, she's kind of warned against this, but, she goes in, but she befalls the same fate. As soon as she touches the golden vessel, she's trapped. And as it turns out, this whole setup, this whole otherworldly setup is a trap from Gwawl, her previous, fiance, I guess you will, and also the work of, let me see if I can say his name right, Huidip Kilcoid, who's a magician. And so they are trapped there, and once Manawydan and Kigva both watch this tower disappear, and they realize, they're gone. They've been taken away. And so in the other world, they are actually treated like beasts of burden. Again, it's funny because Rhiannon had to go through this once before. Now she has to go through it again, where they're both put out to the pasture like animals and chained up at night outside. But Huidip Kelcoid's wife is very lonely, and she starts to go out and she talks to Rhiannon and she talks to Pradami outside. And she happens to be 8 months pregnant. Rhiannon is sort of trying to work her a little bit and tries to learn certain things and find certain things out. And eventually what the wife, she sees her people, that she wants to go run with, but her husband has told her she cannot. And Rhiannon says, well, she goes, I would never let my husband tell me what I can and can't do. I mean, if that's what you want to do, you should be able to go do it. And she doesn't say anything to them, but then it's understood the next day, because there's no feasting and there's no celebrating. There seems to be some discontent because the wife has disappeared, and she's 8 months pregnant. So she has obviously gone on the run. Now, in the human world, or in Dyfed, on the other side of things, Manawydan has this mouse that continually has been eating and stealing his grain. He's getting very frustrated with this, so he is going to catch this mouse, and not only is he going to catch it, he's going to hang it, and the mouse he catches is pregnant. And guess who that mouse is an embodiment of from the other world? Wonder who. So now Kigva tells him, no, you shouldn't torture this poor mouse, because he's going to make a noose and he's going to hang it. And he's determined to do it. So then Huey ends up coming to him and begging him to release the mouse and not to hang it. But he's determined. He's like, nope, I'm going to do it. And so he's saying, I'll promise you this. I'll promise you this. Basically, it gets to a point where Manawydan recognizes what's going on, and he says, will you release? He says, I'll do anything. He says, fine. Will you release Rhiannon, and will you release Pradami? And he says, yes, I will. He says, and you will go away, and you will not visit the curse, any kind of more revenge or any other kind of curse on this household again about this. And he says, yes. So once he sees Rhiannon and Pradami being returned to him, then he releases the mouse, and he doesn't kill it. Okay. So he does, through his magic and through his cunning, also manages to rescue the two of them from their mistake. So this story actually ends happily. The woman goes back to where she was. And what I find interesting, though, is that Gwawl, or Gwawl, I think it's pronounced Gwawl is how you pronounce his name, is, that he is, remember, he has made a promise. When he has to give Rhiannon back to Puesh, he's also sworn that he's not going to get revenge, for this act. But as we can see, he's it's claimed that he's actually part of the one who orchestrates this revenge. In other words, Rhiannon's going to be treated the same way that he feels degraded, the way felt he was degraded by her. Okay, so, So that's really the whole story in a nutshell, as it were. Now, okay, so this latter part of the story, so what's going on here? I do actually want to, I think Moira Caldecott has a very good discussion of this. So I want to kind of find the, okay. So she first talks about the Otherworld, okay, and what it means to encounter the Otherworld. Now, I'm just going to read a little bit here and there from her discussion on page 39 in her book. She says, nearly all esoteric teachings will tell you that you should not call at the gate out of idle curiosity, but only after careful preparations and with a good and serious motive. It almost seems as though the four, feeling lazy and bored on a summer's day, decide to attract an otherworld adventure. Now, she's not sure about this, so she says they might not have known, and of course, at least three of them are somewhat aware, at least, what they're getting into. She says, as another teaching will tell you, though, nothing happens by mistake or chance. They might not have known what they were asking for, they might not have liked what they got, but what they got was what they needed. Otherworld beings may well be, well, she's saying in a higher state than humans. Certainly they are of a broader consciousness than humans, but they are also on a journey. Now, she's saying a journey upward through the realms towards the ultimate one. No, I don't really buy into that. Nonetheless, there is the idea that there are trials and initiations to be passed through. That I would agree with. Okay, so Kigva is the only purely human, and she's the most frightened, and the others face up to it as best they can. So she says it's significant that the landscape looks exactly like the one they're familiar with, and yet it's completely different. And that is a characteristic of the Otherworld. It's also characteristic of a phenomenon that you will see discussed, especially in connection with the fairies and in connection with sacred places. Now, I found this in Ireland. I'm sure it's true other places as well. And that's the phenomenon of the stray sod. Okay, and that is where one treads onto a place that they are familiar with and suddenly become disoriented. You don't know where you are, and something that is very familiar to you, suddenly you can't find your way around or out. This happened to me more than once in Ireland, by the way. Not with such disastrous consequences, because each time I knew what to do to find my way out again, but it was, or I was able to tell the person I was with, this is what we could do to find our way out, or I was able to say or do the right thing to get us out. But that's one of those things. It's this phenomenon. It's like where space and time just suddenly shift, and the Otherworld is very much like that. It is a place that, it certainly seems to be outside of our space and time. To call it the Otherworld is an entirely accurate appellation. So that's what I'm going to say about the Otherworld. Now, it says these four spiritual adventurers have reached a new plane, and on it, she says, this is back to Caldecott, she says they have none of the advantages and privileges that they had on the previous one. They're no longer known to be of a respected royal family. They are not known in any capacity at all. To survive and make their way, they have to start from the beginning with only their innate intelligence and skills. Any refugee has fled from one country where he or she was respected and successful, finds him or herself at the bottom of the ladder in a new country, despised and ignored, and they know the feeling. Only very exceptional people can climb up again, and those who do often receive as their reward the jealousy and enmity of locals who are not so exceptional. So when they try to settle and make good, they're against jealousy and prejudice. Perdummy is ready to punch a few faces, but Mabinogi insists that they rise above it and try again. 3 times, she mentions the Celtic 3, they make good, and 3 times they have to move on. At last discouraged, they go back where they started, but no one can ever go back where they started. They're different, and the land is different. It appears the same as when they left it, but there's a mysterious building not there before. Mabinogi can feel the difference, but Perdummy, impulsive and thoughtless like his father, will not listen to the warning and follows his hounds who are pursuing the great white boar. And she mentions the magic of the boar, as I did. So Perdummy enters another plane of reality by going into the house. It is at once a trick organized by Gwawl in revenge for an old wrong, and at the same time an independent magical mystical initiatory trial through which they must pass. Okay, so she talks a bit about that, and of course Rhiannon forgets her own wisdom and does that. Her mother love blinding her to the smart thing to do, and she also is stuck. And so it says the punishment of Rhiannon and Perdummy, therefore obliquely of Mabinogi and Kigva, who are associated with them, has a double purpose here. She says it teaches that one never escapes the results of actions, that old debts have to be paid off for moving on, And she talks about the idea of punishment of several generations, including the one that Macha puts on the Ulstermen for 9 generations. Second purpose serves that it brings about yet another initiation trial for the 4. Okay, the 2 otherworld beings, Mabinogi and Rhiannon, with cunning and wisdom in equal proportions, succeed in breaking the spell and freeing them all. So they now, in the encounter with Hughie, Mabinogi is approached 3 times for mercy. By a youth, by a man, and an old man, suggests that all through one's life one is faced with decisions to make, personal good name among one's fellows set against justice in an abstract sense. And as she says, the mouse, after all, was caught stealing and therefore due punishment. Mabinogi is offered great financial rewards to divert the natural course, but he ignores or pretends to ignore until the right man, the man whose other half is the mouse, is prepared to sacrifice everything, including himself, to undo what he has done. And so she says, older and wiser, the 4 return to David, or rather David returns to them. No one else has noticed any time passing. In other words, all these trials and adventures happened on the inner planes, outside time and space, as they always do. Now, I would suggest that there's also, there may be something perhaps more than just, because when we say inner space, we assume that this is something that's happening on a psychological level and not on an external level. I would suggest that it's both. Now, again, from the purpose of mythology, we're viewing this as legend. We're not, we're seeing that the truth of this is deeper than the story itself. That the story is pointing to a different kind of a truth. My experience over in Ireland suggests to me that, at least when it comes to the Otherworld, there could be a very literal kind of truth. But that's about all I'm going to say about that in particular. Okay, so there's one other thing I want to talk about before I close. And that is in the second book, there is the reference to something called the Adar Rhiannon, which are the 3 birds of Rhiannon. And these 3 birds are birds that seem quite near, but are actually quite far away, and they are said to wake the dead and lull the living to sleep. Okay. So immediately you see the idea of these birds as being psychopomps, in a way, because they are, for one thing, or even, they even seem to have a kind of a goetic or necromantic kind of a quality, because they can wake the dead and bring them back, or they can also put one to sleep. And in this case, there is before a wedding feast, there is a giant who requests that these 3 birds be caught to entertain him on the night of his death, because apparently there's a foretelling of his death. And because they will lull him to sleep, that will be a much easier passage into death. So, in a sense, what we're looking at here are birds that can either help you cross out of the underworld or into it. Okay, that seems to be the implication here. And birds are a very good choice, because birds have actually, certainly we see this in Western mythology, whether you're talking about Greek, Babylonian, Roman, whatever. There's always an Egyptian. The soul, or at least certain aspects of the soul, are sometimes represented as birds or as having wings. We retain that now when we think about people. Oh, you go to heaven and you get your wings. Yeah, it's not. It's still this idea of the winged soul. The word for soul, anima, is actually connected to a word for birds, and there's definitely a connection there of the idea of the soul taking flight. If you remember in the Odyssey, just as by way of example, when Odysseus encounters his mother in the underworld, he finds he can't grab her. She's just like an illusion, like a shadow, that burst of smoke when he tries to touch her. And he asks if it is a cruel illusion of Queen Persephone. And his mother says, no, it's not. She says, this is what remains, the Eidolon. This is what remains in the underworld. The soul itself, meaning the psyche, or psyche, flies away insubstantial. Okay, so that there's this idea that vital part of you flies away. Okay, so there's this so this definite connection, and we also are seeing it here between birds and the underworld. Now, of course, we don't, we again, I think she brought up the Holy Spirit earlier, and the idea of the Holy Spirit as a dove. That's actually the Holy Spirit's probably a representation of Inanna or Ishtar. It's like it's a taking over of that dove symbol. But that's another completely different symbolic thread, so we won't go on that one here. But that is the other mention of Rhiannon in the Mabinogion. And so, and again, the 3-ness of it, we see the magical properties of the 3 that seem to appear throughout Celtic Celtic folklore and Celtic myth as we know it. Okay, so that is what I have to say on Rhiannon. I hope you've enjoyed this podcast. If you would like to follow more of my work, please check out chthoniya.net. That's where I have my podcasts, my publications, and where I have my school advertised Scholars of the Borderland. If anybody is ever interested in my personal services, where I do one-to-one, I do Reiki therapy, I do tarot, I actually do coaching. More importantly, I do coaching because it kind of combines a lot of different tools that I have learned over the 35 years that I've been doing all this into a kind of personal one-to-one session. You can check out my website, which is called liminalreiki.com. I've actually changed the name of it to Transition Life Coaching because it's actually what I do, but I haven't changed the URL on it. So that's what it's called. And if you're watching this, I usually have the URLs linked in the comments. If you're interested in supporting the work I do on Chthonia in particular, that would be, I do have a Patreon. It's patreon.com/Chthonia. And those who join, typically at the very bottom level, certainly at least you get updates from me, and you also get notification when the episode comes out, the newest episode comes out, and you get first notice. And then people who are at the certain levels and above, you also get extra podcasts, extra commentary from me. And other perks as I have certain work that's completed, I try to make that available, either free or at a discount rate to certain people depending on level, on Patreon as well. So I try to have a variety of rewards. Main one being that you get extra commentary and extra monthly comments or podcasts from me. So though that is it for now. Social media, I'm Chthonia Podcast. 2 words on Facebook, 1 word on Instagram and Twitter, and just Chthonia on YouTube. If you are interested, if you've already subscribed, like, subscribe, follow, leave comments if you like what you hear. And I also want to thank all of my patrons. I have some new patrons, and then the ones who've been around for a while. I want to thank both of you, both groups of you, for supporting me. And with that, I will talk to you in the next episode.